In 1971, Colin Wilson published his very first book on the occult, and it was called, appropriately, The Occult. I remember as a 19-year-old lad buying a copy as soon as it came out. And as I took it down off the bookshelves, if someone had tapped me on the shoulder and said to me, in 43 years' time, you are going to write an introduction to this book, I would have thought he was daft. But daft things happen. And indeed, 43 years later, Watkins Publishing asked me to write an introduction to Colin Wilson's classic book on the occult. They've since now asked me to write 3 more introductions to Colin Wilson reprints. So look out for Super Consciousness, which they are releasing in December, just in time for Christmas. Mysteries, which of course is the second volume of the Occult trilogy. That's coming out in June 2020, just in time for the 3rd International Colin Wilson Conference, which is to be held again in Nottingham in 2020, and a little bit more about that later. And the third book is Beyond the Occult, which is the third in the Occult trilogy. That is due for release on Halloween 2020. I presume they've chosen Halloween for the obvious reasons and not because it will be the first anniversary of us leaving the European Union. In a working life as a professional author spanning over 55 years, Colin Wilson produced an awe-inspiring body of work. 181 books. 600 essays and articles for a variety of magazines and newspapers, 170 introductions to other authors' works, and over 350 book reviews. As his bibliographer, I have struggled to keep pace with him over the years, a fact that never ceased to amuse him. He once said, jokingly, that I would be glad when he eventually died so that I could then at least produce the definitive edition. But alas, I shall never be in a position to do this because I'm constantly discovering items of which I was previously unaware, and appreciations of his contributions to consciousness studies and philosophy continue to appear in print, and new editions of his books continue to appear. There is very much a Colin Wilson resurgence at the moment. Now, selected, edited, and with an introduction and postscript by the author himself, the Essential Colin Wilson was published in 1985. Now, it included key chapters from many of Wilson's most important fiction and non-fiction books, plus some crucial essays, providing an introduction to his many-faceted work for those not already familiar with it, and a handy bite-sized reminder and reference source for established fans and scholars. At the age of just 54, it was Colin Wilson's 74th published book, but although he went on to produce another 100 titles in the 28 years prior to his death in 2013, he never provided an update. So, a couple of years ago, to rectify this, I got in touch with 4 experts on his work. Nicolas Tredell, Geoff Ward, Gary Lachman, and Vaughn Rapatahana, all of whom contributed to his 80th birthday festschrift called Around the Outsider in 2011. And I asked each of them to choose an important post-1985 essay / book extract to supplement two choices of my own. These I have added to the original text of the Essential Colin Wilson to form the ultimate Colin Wilson. Now, Colin was born in Leicester in 1931 and moved to London when he was just 19. There he made a living from a variety of menial jobs, whilst in his spare time at the British Museum's reading room he worked and reworked the novel that was eventually published as Ritual in the Dark. But on Christmas Day 1954, alone in his room, he sketched the outline of a book about the outsider in literature and worked on it furiously during the following year, sometimes sleeping rough on Hampstead Heath to save money. The manuscript was accepted for publication by Victor Gollancz and appeared on May the 28th, 1956 as The Outsider. It became an instant bestseller and made him famous literally overnight. In the ensuing 63 years, it has never been out of print and has been translated into over 30 languages. And incredibly, just a few weeks ago, I received... Oh, thank you. Incredibly, just a few weeks ago, I received in the post from a professor at, I think it was Ankara University, a Turkish translation that he had just done. So new translations and new editions of The Outsider continue to appear. So it's fitting then that the opening chapter of The Outsider, called The Country of the Blind, is included in the ultimate Colin Wilson, as is the fascinating autobiographical introduction to its follow-up, Religion and the Rebel, which came out in 1957. Now, during the next 10 years, he completed his Outsider cycle of 6 philosophical books, with Beyond the Outsider in 1965, and then summarised all 6 volumes in a book entitled Introduction to the New Existentialism in 1966. Now, chapters from both of these important books are naturally included in the ultimate Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson's optimistic new existentialism was a bold move at a time when pessimism held sway in Western philosophy, and it is to his credit that he prepared to stick his neck out and swim against the flow. Despite the French existentialists, he was convinced that we live in a meaningful universe and that mankind is heading towards a new phase in its evolution. His outsiders, as obsessed as they were with these moments of vision in which they achieve a glimpse of this meaning, but then become depressed in the cold light of day when they cannot repeat the experience, were pointers towards this higher state of consciousness. I'm delighted to announce that after being out of print and virtually ignored for 30 years, Introduction to the New Existentialism is now back in print. Ironically, 2 new editions have appeared this May. One, an expensive academic library reprint published by Routledge, proof that his work is now gaining acceptance in academia, and another more affordable edition with an introduction by Nicolas Tredell by Aristea Press. Now, in the 60s, at a time when experimentation with mind-altering drugs was prevalent, Colin Wilson once again had the strength to contradict. His own unfortunate mescaline experience, detailed in the appendix to Beyond the Outsider, confirmed to him that shortcuts to heightened consciousness were not in any way satisfactory. Rather, he advocated a mental discipline based on his interpretation of Edmund Husserl's theory of intentionality, asserting that to live more vital and appreciative lives, we need to learn how to fire our attention at the world out there in order to see it not through a glass darkly, as we invariably do at the present, but as it actually is. When all is said and done, it is in this field of consciousness studies that I believe that Colin Wilson's true legacy lies. Now, during this time, he was also writing novels to complement his non-fiction. He used his fiction as vehicles to put his philosophical ideas into action. And he would quite often write a novel and a non-fiction book concurrently. So he included extracts from his novels The World of Violence, The Mind Parasites, and The Black Room into the Essential Colin Wilson. In addition to these, Nicolas Tredell, the acknowledged authority on Wilson's fiction and author of Novels to Some Purpose, the fiction of Colin Wilson, which was published by my Corpus Press in 2015, Nicolas has chosen a chapter from Wilson's epic science fantasy novels, Spiderworld, The Tower, for the ultimate Colin Wilson. Now, in the late 1960s, Colin Wilson was asked to write a book about the occult. The result was the huge volume, which I mentioned earlier, The Occult, which went on to be a bestseller and an inspiration to many who read it, including, incidentally, our absent friend, Mr. Lachman, who very famously found an abandoned copy of The Occult in his squat in the Bowery in New York when he was playing bass guitar for Blondie. And he's never looked back since then, as we all know. Although the Occult lost Colin Wilson some readers who felt that he had abandoned the rigours of philosophy for a far less worthy subject, he gained many, many more. In fact, however, Colin Wilson had not abandoned philosophy at all. Indeed, he always considered his serious occult books to be a logical extension of his new existentialism, providing evidence that man possesses latent powers which, if tapped and harnessed, could lead to hugely expanded consciousness and potentially even an evolutionary leap. He went on to write 2 more large books on the subject, Mysteries in 1978 and Beyond the Occult in 1988. These became known collectively as his Occult trilogy, and are now acknowledged classics in the field of the occult sciences. The 3 books amounted to a monumental 1,600 pages and spawned many other lesser works on the subject. Wilson's writings on the occult are very well covered in the Ultimate Colin Wilson, with chapters from both the occult and mysteries. Now, his contribution to psychology should not be overlooked, and indeed the Ultimate Colin Wilson reproduces a chapter from his book on the renowned American psychologist Abraham Maslow. The book was called New Pathways in Psychology, Maslow and the Post-Freudian Revolution. Now, Maslow was very impressed with Wilson's work, and the two corresponded and met on several occasions. Wilson's book, based on recordings made by Maslow outlining his life and work, was published in 1972. Unfortunately, 2 years after his subject's death. Maslow's concept of peak experiences, that sudden rush of pure happiness that we all experience from time to time in moments of delight, was of great importance to Wilson, as the title of his Schumacher lecture, Peak Experiences, in 1982 attests. The Other Mode, a chapter from his book Frankenstein's Castle, The Right Brain, Door to Wisdom, published in 1980, is included in the Ultimate Colin Wilson, as is the essay The Laurel and Hardy Theory of Consciousness, in which he compares the two halves of the brain in that brilliant way that Wilson employed to make complex subjects more understandable to general readers, to the way in which the comedians Stan and Ollie interacted. His long-standing interest in criminology, in particular the motiveless murder carried out by serial killers, culminated in a hugely impressive book called A Criminal History of Mankind in 1984, which was updated in 2005. Colin Wilson was always probing to understand the psychology of those negative outsiders who chose to channel their frustrations with society in this way. After delivering a lecture in a Philadelphia jail in 1973, he was convinced that prisoners should be rewarded not just for good conduct, but for being creative and making good use of their period of incarceration. To this end, he corresponded for many years with the Moors murderer, Ian Brady, finally persuading him to write a book instead of focusing his frustrations on the prison authorities. He found a publisher for it and even wrote an introduction, much to the scorn of the moral majority and the tabloid press. His considerable contribution to criminology and true crime writing is well represented in the Ultimate Colin Wilson by several extracts from both the 1984 and the 2005 editions of A Criminal History of Mankind. Now, Geoff Ward, the editor of the Colin Wilson World website, and if you haven't accessed this website, I do recommend it. It's a real sort of cornucopia of Wilsonia, really. You can access it at www.colinwilsonworld.net. Now, Geoff, who runs the site, pointed out quite rightly that there's no extract from any of Wilson's books on existential literary criticism in the Essential Colin Wilson. To rectify this, he has chosen the chapter The Seventh Degree of Concentration from the Books in My Life, which was published in 1998. Dr. Vaughn Rapatahana, author of several books and articles on Wilson, has chosen the important philosophical essay Below the Iceberg, first published in 1994. And our friend Mr. Gary Lachman has picked an extract from Wilson's controversial book on sexual outsiders, The Misfits, which was published in 1988. My own choices are two late essays, The Future of Mankind from the 2005 update of A Criminal History of Mankind, and The Philosophy of Optimism from 2006.
My tutor went to school with Colin Wilson, Gateway School.
Oh, really?
And I'm just wondering how much of an impact Leicester and that sort of environment had on his future development. Because it was the richest city in Europe in the 19th century.
Yeah, yes. Well, I mean, he made no bones about the fact that he couldn't wait to get away from Leicester. He found it sort of stultifying, and he just, as soon as he broke away and went to London, his life sort of opened up for him, and he never went back. Well, I mean, he went back to visit his family occasionally, but he then moved from London to Cornwall, where he stayed for the rest of his life. So, although obviously your home environment as a young person is very important and obviously has a great influence on you, the influence as far as Colin Wilson was concerned was, God, I've got to get away from here.
What was it that he was getting away from?
Well, I think it was just the humdrum, really, the sort of the grind, the daily grind of the working class life that he was brought up in Leicester. Yes, he just found that there wasn't really enough stimulation culturally either, and he had to move on to develop.
He did that. How did he marshal all those facts together, put them all in such a sort of logical, interesting, clear way, without having any kind of professional training about being a book,
Yes, I always wondered that until I went down to stay with him at his house, and he had a very strict routine. I think he would get up very early in the morning, sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning, go and make himself a cup of tea, go and sit back in bed, and then he'd do all his reading. And so by 9 o'clock he was ready to go downstairs and do 6 hours work until about 3 in the afternoon, when he would go for a walk on the cliffs with his dogs or something, and then come home.